All right, this is the third time I've tried to record because when they start speaking over the loudspeaker here for the locks, as their boats come in and out of Lake Washington, the person who's doing the speaking loves to keep talking and talking and talking. So anyways, we'll try this again. So I'm recording my homily for the 8th Sunday in Ordinary Time, and this is the last Sunday before we reach the season of Lent and then into the season of Easter. So this is the last Sunday for Ordinary Time for a little while. So I've been trying to help my community prepare for the season of Lent, because Lent is one of those seasons that we know it's supposed to be really, really powerful. We know that it's supposed to be transformative, and yet it's like halfway through Lent, we're like, oh my goodness, we're in Lent, you know? And so I'm trying to get people prepared beforehand to really make good decisions and take it seriously. For so many years, I didn't really take the season of Lent seriously. I didn't see it as being something that should be the focal point for that time. Whereas if I was in school or if I was working, those always seem to be the focal point. But it's like to put those off kind of on the side and say, no, I have a greater focal point. So a couple ways to keep the season of Lent so that we can have a focal point there of Jesus Christ. A couple things. One is definitely go to confession, right? Go to confession. Ideally, a person should go to confession, I would say, at least 3 to 4 times a year. 3 to 4 times a year, right? So it's kind of like your car, you know, you change your oil every 3,000 miles. I don't really do that. But anyways, you're supposed to change your oil every 3,000 to 4,000 miles because you want your engine in your car to be running as best as it could without it getting damaged, right? Well, it's the same for our soul. We want our soul to be not just not having sin, not just not having mortal sin, right? Like when people come into confession and say, well, Father, I haven't murdered anybody. And it's like, well, good, I'm glad we got that out of the way, right? No, we don't want it to just barely be squeaking by. We want it to be thriving. We want our souls to be actively pursuing God's grace and working towards loving one's neighbor more and more, and et cetera, right? So confession should be part of that. It's such a beautiful avenue of grace. So to be able to truly desire to have that be part of it. Okay, so going to confession. Some people are really afraid to go to confession. I know there's all kinds of different reasons for that. For some, it's been a long time, you know, it's been 10 years, it's been 20 years, it's been however long it's been, and I say, don't worry, go, right? Just go. Sometimes people are afraid, well, you know, Father Peter's going to be mad at me because it's been so long, so I can't really go, and it's like, no, not at all. Go, right? I love it when people come, and it's been a long time, you know, it's like, welcome back, okay? And then just get the sacrament into some kind of a routine for your life. It's not just if we've done mortal sins, right? It's to be growing in mercy, to be growing in that forgiveness. Because when we receive it, then we can give it, right? Yeah. Okay. Just say yes. Just agree with me, okay? All right. So, also, going to daily mass, right? So we have masses on Tuesdays at 6 p.m. You can come after work. We have morning masses. You know, we have Mass in Spanish, tenemos la misa en español, you know, so we have things we're offering so that through the course of the week, you can really allow yourself to have that quiet time and to be able to come together as a community to celebrate the Eucharist. So consider that, maybe just one day a week, in addition to Sunday, one day a week coming to Mass, right? Okay. Fridays, every parish, you know, we have Stations of the Cross. In our parish, we have Stations of the Cross, and we have a soup supper. And then starting in the second week of Lent, I'm going to be offering a book study. Okay? So those are all opportunities. You can come to one or all of them. But to be able to say, okay, Friday evenings during Lent, I'm in church, right? So what if that works for you, that would be great. There's other things going on just, you know, through the course of the season. Something I really was trying to sell my parishioners on this time, something I'd like for us to do as a whole community, is I was asking everybody, we had little cards, have everybody commit to a specific day and a specific time to spend 1 hour in the church, just in front of the Blessed Sacrament, just in quiet prayer, right? Just 1 hour. And if I can get every family to do that, then we're not just doing it as individuals, we're doing it as a family of faith. There's something very powerful about that, right? So Ash Wednesday, what do we all do together? Well, we fast, right? Ash Wednesday is a day of fasting and a day of abstaining from eating meat, right? So that's a day we eat lobster. No, right? No, we don't eat lobster. So the idea is that we're making a sacrifice, right? So we're giving this up so that we can be united all together as a family of faith in doing something spiritual, right? Sometimes I think as Americans, we're very pragmatic, we're very practical, and it's like, well, how does having my stomach growling all day, how does that help anybody? But if we're all doing it together, it can conform our heart to a greater good, right? To something beyond ourselves. And then throughout the day, it just calls that to mind. And so I think it's transformative internally, so that there can be that external transformation, right? And it's also a discipline. It's something that just helps us to grow in discipline. It's not a bad thing, right? It's a good thing. Okay, which is going to tie into my homily this week a little bit. Okay, I think that was everything. Consider any of these or all of these doing something. Make sure the Lent doesn't slip by, right? Because before you know it, the years slip by, and before you know it, we're lying on our deathbed and we haven't been a good disciple. Okay, so this Sunday, Jesus' gospel, he's using a parable, he's using an example to explain hypocrisy. Okay, so last week, if you remember, we finished with Jesus saying, don't judge, right? Be merciful, forgive. And so I'm going to go with that theme just a little bit this week. Now, the example he uses is the splinter in the eye and the wooden beam in the eye, right? So he says, if you think you can tell your neighbor, take out the splinter from your eye, but not first look at yourself and realize, I got this big wooden beam in my eye, right? So I first have to take out the wooden beam, then I can see well enough to take out the splinter. So I want to talk about this a little bit and go a little bit deeper with it, okay? So first things first. Both people in this example are not innocent, right? So one has a splinter in the eye, and the other has a wooden beam. Now, obviously, they're different, but neither are innocent. And so I think that's the first thing to keep in mind, that in our world, we're all sinners, right? And so I think that can help us when we are looking at the world and seeing problems, or looking at someone, like, let's say you're watching the news and you're hearing this politician and you're like, oh, you're going after that politician. And you say, well, wait a minute. I'm a sinner too. He's a sinner, right? Or she's a sinner, right? And so I think that dials it back for us to realize I need to be more patient, more understanding, more forgiving, right? So to realize none of us really, in the end, here on earth, are innocent. Okay, so that's the first thing to keep in mind. Now, the other thing, a splinter. It sounds like, okay, Jesus is saying it's so small that it's insignificant, but not really, because I haven't had a splinter in my eye, but I've had splinters in my fingers. That's why I always wear gloves when I'm working, because I hate them. Because you can have a little tiny splinter. They're so small sometimes you can't even see them, and yet they really disrupt your day. It's like you can't think of anything else until I get this splinter out, right? And so that's the nature of sin. Even little sins, they begin to disrupt everything. And so Jesus is not saying that the splinter is insignificant, but it is a splinter, right? Okay. So I remember as a kid, when we had a splinter, you had to really decide, was it worth it to tell my mom? Because my mom was a nurse, which meant that she knew how to get a splinter out, definitely. But the needle that she used was about 1 foot long, right? And she would stick that needle all the way in. I mean, I'm kidding. But pain was something that was an acceptable part of pulling a splinter out. And so we had to decide, was it more painful to have a splinter or to have it pulled out? But to have a splinter in one's eye, I think it's far more serious, right? So Jesus is not just joking around here. Even a small sin is still significant. It's still disruptive. It still hurts, right? It still hurts. Okay, what about the wooden beam, though? Now, if you have a wooden beam in your eye, I have the sun in my eyes right now, but if you have a wooden beam in your eye, chances are your parish priest is going to be doing your funeral, right? Because I'm not going to survive that. A wooden beam is huge. You're going to die. And so I think that's his point, is he's saying it would be deadly. It would be deadly to have a wooden beam in one's eye. And so he's saying there are some sins that are deadly, and then there are some that hurt. But they're all significant. Okay, so he's saying that there's hypocrisy when someone who has a deadly sin is there criticizing someone for a smaller sin. Hypocrisy. Jesus, the only times he really gets riled is when he sees hypocrisy, especially in leaders, right? Because leaders are so important that their lives are integrated, that there's sincerity in their life, and so when there isn't that, we have hypocrisy. So if I, as a priest, if I tell my people to do something because of the gospel, but I'm not doing it, and so later on, somewhere in the world, somewhere out there in the world, they see me doing the opposite. Like if I tell them, don't speed on the freeway, and then they see me speeding on the freeway, not only are they not going to not listen to me, but they're going to become jaded, because they're going to be like, I can't trust him. But not only that, I represent more than myself. I represent Jesus Christ, the church. And so they're going to say, I can't trust the church. I can't trust Jesus Christ. And so hypocrisy is always serious. It's always the beam, because it destroys. It destroys so much. Now, I can't talk about this without being a hypocrite, because I belong to part of the leadership of the Catholic Church as a priest. I'm part of the hierarchy, right? That's the nature of holy orders. But right now, man, we're struggling. We are really struggling with hypocrisy, because the church has the very large wooden beam in its eye, at least the hierarchy does. Because there's been some really, really horrible things that have been done on behalf of the clergy. And yes, I know it's not all the clergy, and not all the clergy is responsible. But to our world, there is this communicative responsibility for what has happened, which I think is justifiable. Okay, I'm not dismissing that at all. But to the world, there's this giant wooden beam in our eye, and we go to the world then, and we begin to challenge the world morally on moral issues, and they're like, what are you doing? Why should we listen to you, right? Why should you talk to us about this stuff, about these other moral issues, when you got priests doing horrible things and bishops covering it up? I can understand that, right? So we have to first take out the wooden beam. So in the instruction manual that Jesus gives us today in the gospel, he says, okay, first take out the wooden beam. Great, okay, that's part one. Take out the wooden beam. Now, as you're listening to this, here's a little thing to keep in mind. If you're thinking to yourself, right on, that's right, those darn priests, they need to take out that wooden beam. Guess what? You've already fallen into the trap of being judgmental, right? As soon as we begin to say something like, don't judge me, like, how dare you judge me? We hear that a lot in our culture today. Don't judge me. Guess what we just did? We just judged that person judging us. So there's a trap there. So immediately, as we start talking about being judgmental, we have this trap, okay? All right, so I'm moving on here in my theme here from hypocrisy, which is horrible. We need to root that out, right? To the other side of this, which is the judgment part. Now, I've talked about this before. There's a difference between using right judgment, okay, right judgment, and being judgmental. The foundation that Jesus wants to set for us is right judgment. Here's what I mean. Right judgment is based on love. That's really the only qualification per se. Well, I shouldn't say that. That's the main qualification for right judgment. Wisdom, discipline, all of those things are part of it also. But for right judgment, it has to be motivated by love. And so if I have a brother, I have someone, a neighbor, right? And they're doing something harmful to themselves, and I tell them, don't do that. Don't do that. But if I say that honestly and sincerely out of love, because it hurts me and it hurts them, and I want to help them. I truly want to help them. I'm using right judgment. That's a good thing. It's motivated by love, right? Now, in small ways, we use right judgment 1,000 times a day. When you drive from your home to your work, or when you drive from your home to the church, right? You make 100 judgments. There's a red light. I'm going to stop at the intersection because of that red light, right? That's a good judgment. And it's not just because it's the law, but it's because if I choose to drive through that intersection, even though I have a red light, right? I'm using my judgment to do that. That's a bad judgment because people are going to get hurt. We're going to get into a car crash. And I'm not thinking about myself or other people if I were to do that. I'll just be reckless or whatever it may be, right? And so we use right judgment all the time. I'm gonna abide by the rules, not just because I'm abiding by the rules, but because that would be the right thing to do if I care about people around me, if I care about myself and I care about everybody else. So love is the foundation for right judgment. When we have that foundation in place, we're never going to necessarily say, don't judge me, right? Because that's not from a position of love. We've already begun to look down on that person because they're looking down on us. Satan loves that dynamic because then it just breeds fear and hatred, which are the foundations for being judgmental. Why do people become judgmental? Pride. How dare you look down on me, right? How dare you judge me? How dare you say this? How dare you do that? Or it's when we begin to look down, it's like that person's not very smart because I'm smarter than that person. I'm better than that person. Whatever it may be, you have this discrepancy in dignity and respect, and therefore the judgmental side of it comes out. So pride, the heart of that is fear, which can sometimes turn into hatred. What's an example? Racism. Racism is a perfect example of this. I mean, how silly can we get as human beings? I look at somebody's skin color and I make a judgment on their dignity based on that. It's like something, kindergartners would do. It's really silly. And so it's a form of being judgmental, right? Out of pride. Why do we become racist? Fear. Fear turns into hatred, right? So that model of operating is not a healthy model. And so if we watch the news, right, and we see how they often bicker and fight, very rarely do you see any love. It's all a battle to conquer, to win, to destroy the enemy, right? That's not where Jesus is. That's not the foundation where Jesus is. Now, with right judgment, we will have courage, we will have all those things, but we operate with a very different base. It's out of love for my enemy, out of love for the others. Okay, all right, I'm sorry, I beat that horse to death. Okay, there was something I wanted to say. Oh, yes. Sometimes, I remember a while back somebody said to me, he says, love has no rules. Love has no rules. And if we're saying love is the foundation for right judgment, then right judgment has no rules. And that's not correct at all. In fact, it's the opposite of what is correct. But I think I know what that person was trying to say. That person was trying to say, love has no boundaries. Love should extend everywhere. And that I agree with, 100%. But love has lots of rules, right? So If I choose to not use foul language, bad words, curse, take God's name in vain, if I choose not to do those things out of respect for my neighbor, because it's just vulgar and ugly and disgusting when people do that, right? When I choose not, I'm doing that out of love. Well, I've now placed a rule on myself. I can't do that. But somebody who doesn't care, they have no rules. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right. If I choose not to lie because I want to respect my neighbor, if I choose not to steal because I love my neighbor, if I choose not to kill, not to envy, not to lie, cheat, steal, not to... there was another one in there. Anyways, if I choose not to do these things, I am choosing to place rules on myself. I'm carrying a burden for the sake of love of my neighbor. And the greater our love, the more rules, if you will, we have, but the more right judgment we will also have. Okay, now, that's great. None of this, though, we can do on our own. God's grace feeds all of this. He helps us to grow. He helps us to have greater right judgment, to have wisdom and love and all these things, right? Understanding, knowledge, all the gifts of the Holy Spirit, all these things. And it also prevents us then from doing what He's warning us about in the gospel, right? About having this giant wooden beam in our eye. Okay, so anyways, going back to that story, he says, take the wooden beam out of your eye. So let's say we've done that, we've gone to confession, or we've repented, we've changed our life. Then he says, now take the splinter out of your neighbor's eye. And that's important, right? Again, right judgment, rooted in love, we seek and desire to help our neighbor. Alrighty, blessings on your start of Lent, and I will see you next week.